May 17th, 1945. The wind carried ash across the compound. Greta Hoffman sat on the wooden bench outside the barracks at Camp 186 in Yorkshire, her body rigid, her hands folded in her lap. She did not move when the British sergeant walked past. She did not look up when he nodded. She simply sat, feeling the rough planks beneath her, feeling everything her body had learned to expect, and finding only the dull ache of prolonged stillness. "It hurts when I sit," she had told the other women that morning. Not because of violence, not because of cruelty, but because her body had been prepared for something that never came. 12 days earlier, Greta had been a signals auxiliary with the Wehrmacht communications unit retreating through the Netherlands. She wore the grey-blue uniform of the Nachrichtenhelferinnen, carried her gas mask in its tin canister, and believed absolutely in the stories whispered through the collapsing Reich. The British and Americans were coming. They would do to German women what the Bolsheviks had done in the East. The reports had filtered back through the ranks, through the wounded soldiers, through the desperate civilians fleeing westward. 2 million women. The number was spoken in mess halls and bunkers and field hospitals. 2 million German women violated by the Red Army as it ground through Prussia and Pomerania and Silesia. The mathematics of conquest written on female bodies. Greta had heard the stories from soldiers who had seen their sisters, their mothers, their wives brutalized in the Soviet advance. She had read the hasty scrawled letters that reached the communication posts, letters that said only this happened, and we could not stop it. She had watched the refugees streaming past her unit's position, women with hollow eyes, and children who no longer cried. She understood what occupation meant. She understood what happened when armies moved through territories and found women in their path. History had taught this lesson in every war, in every century, in every language. Armies took what armies wanted. Victors claimed their spoils. The vanquished paid in flesh. So when her unit commander ordered them to scatter on May the 5th, when he told them the British were advancing and capture was inevitable, Greta made preparations. She discarded her identification papers. She hid her wedding ring. She wore her thickest undergarments, layer upon layer, as if cloth could be armour. She and the other women in her unit discussed in whispers whether death might be preferable. They had cyanide capsules, though no one was certain they were real. They had heard that some women bit through their own tongues rather than submit. They had heard that mothers killed their daughters before the soldiers arrived. They had heard everything, and they believed it all, because the reports from the East had been true. The British patrol found them on May the 7th, huddled in a barn outside Meppen. Greta remembered the moment with perfect clarity. The door swung open. Light flooded in. She saw the silhouettes of soldiers, heard the sharp commands in English, felt her body prepare for what was coming. She closed her eyes. She clenched her fists. She prayed to a God she was no longer certain existed. And then, nothing happened. The soldiers told them in broken German to come out. They were searched for weapons. They were given water. They were loaded onto trucks and driven west, away from the fighting, into captivity that felt nothing like what captivity was supposed to feel like. At the processing centre in Osnabrück, Greta and 60 other women stood in lines while British officers checked their names against lists. They were given new identification cards. They were photographed. They were assigned to barracks groups. The female British auxiliary, who processed Greta's papers, asked if she needed medical attention. The question confused her. Medical attention for what? For the violence that had not occurred? For the brutality that existed only in her imagination and her terror? She shook her head. The auxiliary stamped her papers and moved to the next woman in line. The journey to England took 3 days. They crossed the Channel on a transport ship, packed into holds that smelled of diesel and salt water and fear that was slowly transforming into bewilderment. Greta stood at the railing as the white cliffs appeared through the morning fog. Dover, the ancient fortress of England. She had seen these cliffs in propaganda films, had heard them described as the final barrier before the invasion that never came. Now she was crossing that barrier as a prisoner, and still nothing happened. British sailors walked past. They did not leer. They did not reach out. They simply walked past, carrying out their duties, treating the German women as cargo to be transported, nothing more and nothing less. Camp 186 sat on former farmland in the Yorkshire Dales, a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by wire fencing. The women arrived in late afternoon, exhausted and disoriented. They were shown to their quarters, given blankets and mess kits, told the schedule for meals and roll call. The barracks held 30 women in 2 rows of bunks. There were windows, there were stoves for heat, there were latrines with doors that closed. Greta lay on her bunk that first night and waited for the sounds she had been taught to expect. Boots in the corridor, doors kicked open, screaming. She waited until dawn and heard nothing but the wind and the other women breathing and the distant bleating of sheep in the fields beyond the wire. The food arrived in the morning. Porridge with milk, bread with margarine, tea so strong it tasted of peat and smoke. The women sat at long tables in the mess hall and stared at their plates. One woman named Ilse began to cry, not from sadness, but from confusion. She had been captured near Hamburg with a Luftwaffe ground crew. She had expected starvation. She had expected to be worked to death, to be used and discarded. Instead, she was eating porridge thick enough to stand a spoon in, and the British camp cook was asking if anyone wanted seconds. The question itself seemed impossible. Seconds. As if there was abundance, as if there was enough to spare. In the first week, the women moved through the camp like ghosts, touching nothing, saying little, waiting for the situation to reveal its true nature. Surely this was temporary. Surely the real punishment would begin. Greta watched the British guards, studied their movements, tried to decipher their intentions. They were soldiers, most of them young men who had fought through France and Belgium and Germany. They had seen horrors. They had lost friends. They had every reason to hate. Yet they performed their duties with a mechanical indifference that was somehow more disturbing than cruelty would have been. They checked identification at the gates. They counted heads at roll call. They maintained the wire and the watchtowers. They did not touch the prisoners. The realization came gradually, painfully, like blood returning to a numbed limb. This was not an elaborate deception. This was not a pause before violence. This was simply how the British ran their prisoner camps. They followed rules. They maintained procedures. They treated prisoners according to the Geneva Convention protocols that Germany itself had signed in 1929 and then selectively ignored. The women were to be housed, fed, given medical care, and eventually repatriated. Nothing more, nothing less. The machinery of bureaucratic detention grinding forward without passion or cruelty. By the second week, some women began to venture questions to the guards. Greta, who spoke reasonable English learned from a governess before the war, asked the sergeant about male privileges. He consulted a clipboard and told her that prisoners could send 1 letter per month, subject to censorship. She could write to family members if their addresses were known. The Red Cross would assist in tracing missing relatives. His tone was neither kind nor unkind. He was simply conveying information, the way one might give directions to a stranger on a street. When she thanked him, he nodded and walked away, already focused on the next item in his daily routine. The camp library opened in June. 300 books in a wooden shed, most of them donated by local churches and civic organizations. German language books were scarce, but there were English novels, agricultural manuals, religious texts. The women could borrow 2 books per week. They could sit in the reading room on Sunday afternoons. Some of the younger women began to practice their English, stumbling through simple sentences, asking each other the meanings of words. Greta found a collection of Wordsworth poems and spent her evenings puzzling through the verses, searching for meaning in lines about daffodils and clouds and intimations of immortality. It was Ilse who first spoke the thought that all of them had been having. They were sitting outside on a warm evening in late June, watching the sunset paint the hills orange and gold. "The war is over," Ilse said quietly, "and we are still alive. We are still ourselves. Nothing was taken from us except our freedom, and even that is held loosely, like a bird that could fly away if the hand opened. Greta looked at her hands, at the calluses from operating telegraph keys, at the scars from minor injuries, at the simple fact of their existence. In the East, millions of women had not been so fortunate. In the chaos of the Soviet advance, in the vengeance of an army that had seen its own villages burned, millions of women had paid the price of total war. The British had made a different choice, not out of kindness necessarily. Not out of any special virtue, but out of a commitment to rules, to procedures, to the idea that even in war there were limits that should not be crossed. The Geneva Convention was not just words on paper. It was a barrier between civilization and chaos, a line that said here we stop, here we maintain some fragment of human dignity even for our enemies. The British had stood on their side of that line and honoured it, even when they had no obligation to do so, even when the German nation had violated every principle it claimed to uphold. This realization brought no joy. It brought something more complicated, more painful. It brought shame. Greta sat on the bench and felt the weight of understanding pressing down on her shoulders. She had believed the propaganda. She had accepted without question that the British and Americans would behave as the Soviets had behaved, that all armies were the same, that conquest inevitably meant violation. She had been wrong, not innocently wrong, not mistakenly wrong, but wrong in a way that revealed the depth of the lies she had believed about herself, her nation, her cause. The propaganda had taught her that Germany fought for civilization against Bolshevik barbarism. The propaganda had taught her that the British were plutocratic oppressors, that the Americans were mongrel degenerates, that the Jews were parasites destroying European culture. The propaganda had been so constant, so pervasive, so interwoven with every aspect of daily life that she had absorbed it like breathing. She had not questioned. She had not resisted. She had served the communication networks that coordinated the war machine, had transmitted the orders that sent men to die, had been a small but functional part of an enormous apparatus of destruction. And now she sat in a British prison camp, treated humanely, fed adequately, given books to read and time to think, and she understood that everything had been inverted. The barbarians were the ones who built the camps at Auschwitz and Treblinka. The parasites were the ones who engineered genocide as state policy. The degenerates were the ones who worshipped strength and despised mercy and built a civilization on the principle that might makes right. Germany had looked into the abyss and called it destiny. Germany had embraced darkness and named it light, and millions had followed, Greta among them, because following was easier than questioning, because belonging felt safer than standing apart, because the crowd moved in one direction and to step aside required a courage she had not possessed. The other women in the camp experienced their own reckonings. Some refused to accept the evidence before their eyes, convinced themselves that the decent treatment was a trick, a psychological operation designed to break their loyalty. They clung to the Nazi ideology like drowning swimmers clinging to debris, because to let go meant facing the void of everything they had believed and served. Others collapsed into despair, recognizing their complicity but finding no path toward redemption. A few, very few, began the painful work of reconstruction, trying to build some new understanding of themselves and their nation from the ruins of the old. Greta chose a middle path. She accepted responsibility for her service, acknowledged the lies she had believed, recognized the crimes committed in her nation's name. But she also granted herself the small mercy of understanding that she had been young, indoctrinated, surrounded by propaganda from childhood. She had believed because everyone around her believed, or pretended to believe, or stayed silent rather than challenge the belief. She had been a particle carried along in a great wave of collective madness, and while that did not excuse her choices, it helped her understand how those choices had been possible. In August, the camp administration began showing films on Saturday evenings, educational films mostly about British history and democratic institutions. But one evening, they showed newsreel footage from the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. The room fell silent as the images flickered across the screen. The piles of emaciated corpses, the skeletal survivors, The British soldiers using bulldozers to push bodies into mass graves because there were too many dead to bury individually. The camp commander standing trial, trying to explain the unexplainable, justifying the unjustifiable. Greta sat in the darkness and watched and felt something fundamental shift inside her. She had known, vaguely, that camps existed. She had heard rumours about deportations, about harsh treatment of Jews and other undesirables. But she had not known the scale, had not imagined the systematic nature of the killing, had not confronted the simple arithmetic of genocide. 6 million Jews. The number was almost meaningless in its enormity. It exceeded comprehension, exceeded the capacity of the mind to grasp. But the images on the screen were comprehensible. Each body was a person. Each empty stare was a life ended. Each pile of bones was somebody's son or daughter or mother or father. After the film, no one spoke. The women filed out of the hall in silence and returned to their barracks. Greta lay awake all night, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the nation she had believed in with the nation that had built Belsen and Auschwitz. They were the same nation, the same government, the same people. The same culture that produced Goethe and Schiller and Beethoven had also produced the gas chambers and the crematoriums. There was no explanation that satisfied. There was no understanding that made sense. There was only the brutal fact of it, the undeniable reality that civilization was a thin veneer over something monstrous, and that veneer had been stripped away to reveal what Germany truly was. The letters began arriving in September. The Red Cross had located some family members, had established postal connections between the camp and the ruins of Germany. Greta received a letter from her mother in Hamburg, written in a shaky hand on paper, torn from a ledger book. The city was rubble. Food was scarce. The occupation was strict, but not brutal. Her father had died in the bombing in 1943. Her brother had not returned from the Eastern Front and was presumed dead. Her younger sister was alive, working in a British military kitchen for food rations. They were surviving. Barely, but surviving. Greta read the letter a dozen times, memorizing every word. Her mother did not mention politics. She did not mention the war's outcome. She did not mention blame or guilt or responsibility. She mentioned only the daily struggle to find food, to keep warm, to continue existing. The great ideological struggle had been reduced to its essential components: bread, shelter, survival. Everything else was luxury, abstraction, the concern of people who had enough to eat. In her reply, censored by British authorities before mailing, Greta wrote about the weather in Yorkshire, about the books in the camp library, about the porridge they ate for breakfast. She did not write about the film from Belsen. She did not write about her shame. She did not write about the British soldiers who treated her with bureaucratic indifference rather than vengeance. She wrote about small things. Ordinary things, the kind of details that fill letters between people who have nothing important to say, because everything important has already been said by events. The repatriation began in October 1945, but proceeded slowly. Britain needed labourers, and many German POWs were retained for agricultural work and reconstruction projects. The women in Camp 186 were gradually released in groups of 10 or 20, sent back to Germany with travel papers and enough food for the journey. Some women volunteered to stay longer, preferring the certainty of camp life to the chaos of bombed-out cities. Others were desperate to return despite the hardship, desperate to find surviving family members, desperate to see what remained of home. Greta was released in December 1945, part of a group of 30 women transported to Hamburg via Dover and Hook of Holland. She carried a small canvas bag containing her few possessions, a change of clothes, a bar of soap, the Wordsworth poem she had been allowed to keep, and 3 letters from her mother. She crossed the Channel on a cold, grey morning, watching England recede into the mist. She had been a prisoner for 7 months. She had been treated by the standards of 20th century warfare with remarkable decency. She had been fed, housed, given medical care, and now released to return to her devastated homeland. She owed her captors nothing and everything. Nothing because they had simply done what was required. Everything because they had reminded her that humanity was still possible, even between enemies. Hamburg was unrecognizable. Greta stood at the central station and turned in slow circles, trying to orient herself. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. Buildings stood as hollow shells, roofless and gutted. Rubble filled the streets in enormous piles, and work crews moved through the ruins, clearing paths, salvaging bricks, searching for bodies still buried beneath the debris. The population moved like ghosts, grey-faced and hollow-eyed, focused on the immediate necessities of survival. She found her mother living in a basement room, beneath a partially collapsed apartment building. The reunion was quiet, tearful, exhausted. They held each other and said little because words seemed inadequate to the moment. What could be said? They had survived. Millions had not. Germany had lost the war, lost its cities, lost its future. Now came the long work of rebuilding, both the physical structures and the moral foundations that had been demolished as thoroughly as the buildings. Greta found work with the British occupation authorities, translating documents and facilitating communication between the military government and German civilians. It was strange work, serving the conquerors, but she did it efficiently and without complaint. The British officers treated her with the same bureaucratic indifference she had experienced in the camp. She was useful. She performed a function. Personal feelings on either side were irrelevant. In the evenings, she walked through the ruins and tried to make sense of what had happened. Germany had gambled everything on conquest and lost. The price had been catastrophic. Millions dead, cities destroyed, the nation occupied, divided, traumatized. And yet, in the midst of that catastrophe, small mercies had been granted. The British could have exacted vengeance. They could have matched horror with horror. Instead, they had maintained discipline, followed rules, treated prisoners according to international law. It was not kindness, but it was not cruelty either. It was something more valuable: consistency. The application of principles even when passion argued otherwise. Years later, in the 1960s, Greta would tell her daughter about the war. Not in detail and not all at once, but in fragments, memories shared during quiet conversations. She would describe the terror of expecting violation and finding only indifference. She would describe the shame of realizing the propaganda had been lies. She would describe the slow, painful process of rebuilding identity after everything she had believed had been revealed as false. Her daughter would ask the obvious question: how could an entire nation believe such things? How could educated people, civilized people, cultured people convince themselves that genocide was justified, that conquest was destiny, that might made right? Greta would have no satisfying answer. She would say only that it happened gradually, that each step seemed small, that no single moment felt like the crossing of a terrible line. She would say that people believed because believing was easier than doubting, because conformity was safer than resistance, because the crowd moved in one direction and stepping aside required courage most people did not possess. And she would tell her daughter about sitting on a wooden bench in Yorkshire, feeling the ache of prolonged stillness, understanding for the first time that violence could be withheld as well as inflicted. She would explain that this was the difference between barbarism and civilization. Not the absence of the capacity for cruelty, but the choice to constrain that capacity through law and custom and mutual agreement. The British soldiers who guarded Camp 186 were no less capable of violence than the Soviet soldiers who ravaged Prussia. The difference was not in their natures, but in their systems, their institutions, their commitments to principles that transcended immediate anger and desire for revenge. "It hurts when I sit," Greta had told the other women in the camp, and they had understood. The hurt was not physical. It was the pain of shame, the ache of complicity, the burden of understanding what had been done in their names and with their cooperation. It was the hurt of recognizing that they had been willing participants in a great crime, that their service had enabled horrors, that their silence had been a form of consent. That hurt would never entirely fade. It would remain, a permanent reminder, a scar that marked them as survivors of a self-inflicted catastrophe. But alongside that hurt was something else, something harder to name. It was the complicated gratitude of a person who expected the worst and received something better. It was the bewildering discovery that enemies could behave honorably. It was the slow realization that the categories of good and evil were not as simple as the propaganda had suggested, that nations and armies and political systems existed on a spectrum, and that the spectrum mattered, that the differences between democratic restraint and totalitarian excess were differences that determined whether millions lived or died. The British had taught her this lesson without meaning to, without even knowing they were teaching it. They had simply followed their procedures, maintained their discipline, and honoured their commitments. And in doing so, they had demonstrated that civilization was possible even in the aftermath of total war, that rules could be maintained even when passion argued for their abandonment, that humanity could be preserved even between enemies. The decades passed. Germany rebuilt, divided into East and West, occupied, gradually granted sovereignty, slowly transformed from pariah to partner. The women who had been prisoners in British camps scattered across the new Germany, carrying their private memories, their private shames, their private gratitudes. Most never spoke publicly about their experiences. What was there to say? They had served the wrong side, believed the lies, enabled the crimes. Their decent treatment as prisoners did not absolve them. It only complicated the narrative, added uncomfortable nuance to what should have been a simple story of evil punished and good triumphant. Greta lived until 1998, dying at age 76 in a nursing home outside Hamburg. Her daughter found her mother's papers after the death, letters, photographs, documents, and a small leather-bound notebook filled with reflections written over 50 years. The last entry, dated a week before her death, returned to that morning in May 1945. To the moment of sitting on a wooden bench and feeling the absence of expected violence. She wrote, "I learned that day that the measure of a civilization is not in its capacity for cruelty, which all humans possess, but in its willingness to constrain that capacity through law and custom. The British could have done to us what we feared. They chose not to. That choice cost them nothing and gave us everything. It gave us the chance to survive, to rebuild, to try again. Without that chance, there would be only revenge, only matching horror with horror, only the endless cycle of violence that destroys both victor and vanquished. The choice to break that cycle, to say here we stop, here we hold to standards even when we have the power to abandon them. That is what separates civilization from barbarism. I served barbarism and was captured by civilization. The irony of this would be funny if it were not so painful. But perhaps the pain is the point. Perhaps the hurt of understanding is what prevents forgetting. Perhaps the ache of shame is what makes redemption possible. The wind carries ash no longer. The camps are gone, dismantled, their barracks recycled into other structures or rotted into the earth. The women who live there are dead or dying, their memories fading, their testimonies scattered through archives and family collections. But the lesson remains, carved into history like words on a monument. Power can be exercised with restraint. Enemies can be treated with decency. Law can constrain passion. Civilization can survive even total war if those who hold power choose to honor the principles that make civilization possible. It hurts when I sit. The hurt is remembering. The hurt is understanding. The hurt is carrying the weight of choices made and consequences borne. But the hurt also means something survived. Something persisted through the catastrophe. Some fragment of humanity remained intact, waiting to be rebuilt, waiting for the chance to try again, to do better, to create something that might justify the suffering and the shame and the terrible cost of learning what should never have needed to be learned. The woman sits on the bench, feeling the ache of existence. And in that ache is the price of survival, the burden of memory, and the faint, stubborn hope that humans might someday learn to choose differently, to build institutions that constrain their worst impulses, to create civilizations that honor dignity even when they have the power to destroy it. The hope is fragile. The hope has been betrayed 1,000 times, but the hope persists because without it, there is only the darkness, only the eternal cycle of violence and revenge, only the end of everything that makes human life worth preserving. The bench is empty now. The camp is gone. The woman who sat there is dust. But the truth she learned remains, waiting for each new generation to discover it, to test it, to decide whether to honor it or abandon it. The choice is always before us. The bench is always there. The question is always the same. What will we do with our power? How will we treat our enemies? Where will we draw the line between what we can do and what we should do? The answer determines everything. The answer decides whether we build civilization or barbarism, whether we break the cycle or perpetuate it, whether we choose restraint or revenge. It hurts when I sit. It hurts because understanding is painful. It hurts because complicity leaves scars. It hurts because redemption is never complete, never final, never enough to balance the scales. But the hurt means something survived. And in that survival is the possibility, however fragile, of learning, of growing, of becoming something better than what we were. The possibility is not guarantee, but it is not nothing either. It is the thread that runs through history, the hope that persists despite all evidence to the contrary, the stubborn insistence that humans can choose mercy over vengeance, can build rather than destroy, can honor dignity even in the midst of chaos.